you with our introductory lecture on the shifting sense of trust in a changing media landscape. And I'm very happy and proud to introduce Donya Alinejad. She is a postdoc researcher from the University of Utrecht and lecturer in media studies at the University of Amsterdam. Donya, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, José. Thank you very much for kicking off the conference, and indeed a warm Zoom welcome to everyone joining. When this conference was first envisioned, we could scarcely have imagined how urgent the theme of media and trust and expertise would soon become. With the outbreak of the COVID-19 global pandemic, we saw the first pandemic of the current media. Many of you are already perhaps familiar with by now. This has meant that experts have been able to track and analyze data on a vast scale and intense pace, that public health messaging has been able to travel rapidly, and that the public role of accurate reporting has been thrust into the spotlight. But we've also seen how the authority of traditional gatekeepers of truth, knowledge, and expertise have been challenged or sidestepped as new media actors, processes, and institutions have taken the stage. Over the past year of the pandemic, we've all been able to follow firsthand how these dynamics have taken shape. In this opening talk, we'd like to kick off this exciting conference on trust in a changing media landscape by offering some thoughts and questions that may be relevant for our ensuing discussions. To help ground and illustrate these points, I'll zoom into a context José and I have recently studied, namely the Dutch media debate about the corona pandemic in its early stages in the Netherlands. On this, we've recently published an article in the journal Social Media and Society. We focused in this research on the public debate immediately following the COVID-19 outbreak in the Netherlands, particularly between March 12th and going on until late June 2020, so almost 4 months. We did that driven by the question, what is the role of social media in spreading expert knowledge during the first stage of the pandemic? I'll first discuss this question as I sketch the early stage debate in the Netherlands. And then after that, I'll build on it by addressing the second, more general question we have, namely, how does social media affect the dynamics of science communication? So what was social media's role in spreading expert knowledge? Here, we were particularly interested in how government deployed social media to steer information flows and manage public opinion. And in tracing the media debate, we identified two distinct phases. First, the medical emergency response phase, which was around March and April 2020, and then the smart exit strategy phase that went from around May to June and July and a little bit onwards. So in the first phase, one of the key concerns of government was to counteract the spread of misinformation on social media. Government officials of the RIVM, or the National Institute for Health and Environment, started to work with Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to direct users to information, official information. Officials also sought to spread information about social distancing measures through hiring influencers with hundreds of thousands of young followers on YouTube. And one of these was singer Famke Louise, to whom I'll return in a minute, who also happened to have 1 million followers on Instagram. At the same time, mass news media supported scientists and policymakers in their efforts. airing programs to explain the facts and fiction about coronavirus, and televising experts replying to questions from non-experts that had been gathered via social media. In this way, mainstream news media reinforced institutional trust in expertise as well as trust in mass media itself. In this same period, social media was mobilized by healthcare professionals to distribute emotional narratives. Narratives of illness, stress, and grief. An interesting counterpoint to the rational narratives of the daily statistics featured on television news at the time. Nurses started making their own video clips as patients and their families similarly posted eyewitness reports to Twitter and YouTube. Mainstream news media, such as the NOS news broadcast channel, then copied this format by starting a program called Messages from the Front, which aggregated and aired these types of social media posts. In this phase, institutions of government and mass media adopted the strengths of social media through its reach, its logics, and its styles. And they did this in ways that mostly enhanced their own authority in the public eye. Then in April, we saw something of a shift. The smart exit strategy phase emerged. The economic narrative had been there all along, but after 6 weeks of the so-called intelligent lockdown, the public debate moved away from matters of medical expertise alone. Bigger questions appeared, namely, how is the country going to pay for the lockdown and medical costs thereof? The question was raised by economic experts, politicians, and leading figures in business, all beginning to weigh in on the discussion with various different interests. This moment in particular was when critical voices started really demanding the input of a broader range of experts. And Marian Koopmans, advisor to the WHO and the Dutch outbreak management team, admits, quote, "No one person is an expert on how we get out of this situation together," end quote. The outbreak management team is then expanded to include other experts, behavioral scientists, economists, psychologists, communication specialists, etc. So what is the role of social media in this shift? Well, increasingly, non-experts take to social media to call for government to be more responsive to their concerns, claiming they no longer accept the, quote, expertise of a small group of virologists. The critical citizen wants to be heard, read headlines, and the government is asked to take note of what citizens think are the best solutions. Dutch celebrities and public figures without specific relevant expertise start to launch solution ideas. Things like ventilators in buildings would work better than social distancing, confining older people to nursing homes without contact, and other proposals spread in the media. Sometime after this, also, a media scandal even arises when some of the main social media influencers who had been paid to spread public health information early on actually start a social media campaign to encourage rejection of the lockdown measures. Influencer Famke Louise, who I mentioned earlier, is the most visible among them. Ultimately, this phase points to a strategic dilemma for authorities. Social media are used to platform both legitimate concerns raised about the kinds of expertise being consulted, and they also facilitate a forceful reemergence of disinformation campaigns. In particular, those of a corona-skeptical action group now called Virus Truth, a group that has gone on to challenge official virus control methods by taking government bodies to court over various rules. So what can we abstract from all this towards our second, more conceptual question? How does social media affect the dynamics of science communication? In other words, what does this case show us about the dynamics between government, scientific experts, media, and publics more generally? Well, over the past decade, we've witnessed a changing media communication landscape. Before the emergence of social media, we were largely relying on an institutional model of science communication with distinct roles for various actors. Linear vectors of information then went from science experts such as virologists and to policymakers. Policymakers then made their choices based on scientific expertise presented to them and communicated this to the public through mainstream news media. Of course, that model has never been as linear as it appears. There has always been information traffic from scientists directly to news media, and public opinion has always affected policymaking and news media to some extent. However, over the past 10 years in particular, with the rapid growth of commercial, data-driven social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc., we've seen a significant push of non-expert voices to the middle of public debates. In the networked model of science communication, social media have taken center stage. Multiple information flows circulate through these platforms. And this affects public debate and disrupts institutional processes of knowledge making, policy making, and sense making. During the pandemic, social media proved an accelerator of distributing scientific information, but also disinformation. And in both these instances, notable flows of social media propelled communication were pushing of emotional appeals, giving equal weight to and credibility to institutional and non-institutional sources, and relying heavily on influences of friends and trends, which platforms tend to support. This shift has a few key implications. First, the networked model of science communication transforms rather than replaces the institutional model. This means a fierce negotiation goes on between the commercial values that social media platforms espouse and the public values that government and civil society actors articulate. Second, mainstream media appropriate social media dynamics by copying formats and styles to refurbish their own message and gain reach and popularity. Third, and finally, social media platforms and the tech companies behind the most powerful ones invest in gaining public trust by adopting some institutional features. For example, fact-checking for misinformation, promoting certain trustworthy sources over others through ranking systems, or using mechanisms that institutionalize the disqualification of certain disinformation. In other words, institutional and networked models mutually shape one another, and this is an ongoing process. Now, of course, this discussion still leaves many important questions to investigate. Key among them is not, however, will AI fake news take over the world this decade, as this diagram suggests, although we can debate that. But rather, one important question is, what implications might the changing model of science communication have for public understanding of expertise? How best can experts adapt their communication strategies in this new landscape? And what do these changes mean for institutional trust? These questions are among many others we will elaborate on together at this conference. And this will hopefully hopefully further our understanding of the shifting sands of trust and trustworthiness in today's changing media landscape. And José will now introduce some of the key ideas that will be featured.
Thank you very much, Donya, for this part. And yes, I would love to introduce some of the paradigms and issues and environments and contexts that we will talk about over the next few days. To give you an idea of what will be happening in the parallel sessions, which you will not all attend, but some of them are more geared towards exploring paradigms. Some are more geared towards exploring specific issues. And just to give you an idea, here's a list of what the kind of issues that we are dealing with, starting with paradigms. Donya, the next slide. We will be talking, there will be several keynotes and a roundtable and a number of sessions that cover like paradigmatic changes such as trust in media or trust in experts and trust in knowledge and knowledge making. Of course, we will spend more time on governing trust and of course, trust in governance, which are two different issues, which are both at the heart of what this conference is about. We will also talk more about specific issues, and Donya has just introduced the issue of course, COVID-19, but in the next slide, we will also cover the issue of climate change in one or two sessions in the afternoon and tomorrow afternoon. We will have more. I think we'll have at least 3 sessions on COVID-19 and its consequences, on the pandemic, on vaccination, trust in, all kinds of issues surrounding this important theme. We will have several sessions on polarization and disinformation, but also on conspiracy theories, which are at the heart of trust, of course, and particularly uprooting trust. Basically, more generally, we will discuss technologies of trust as they enter the media landscape, which is a very important part of what is covered in the sessions. In terms of context and media environments, we will be looking at the rising stakes of journalism. Journalism, of course, has been changed in this changing media landscape with a lot of online social media that have sort of penetrated the landscape of journalism and are interchanged with the norms and the norms of journalism. Several sessions will be taking that as a point of departure. We will talk more about platform logics and digital media production, a very important cause of a changing media landscape. Then we will have some sessions that focus particularly on algorithmic design and particularly personalization, what that does to the media landscape. And finally, we will, of course, discuss the matters of platform architectures. How are these architectures changing what we see in a shifting sense of a media landscape? And finally, we will be looking at contexts, the contexts of political change. Political change has, of course, been on our minds for the past 5 years at least, but particularly the democratic dynamics that are at stake here in that changing media landscape are of great importance. We will talk more generally about contested public values. What are the kind of public values that are at stake in this changing media landscape? And then we cannot ignore, neither escape, the impact of populist movements on that landscape. So all in all, I think we are facing a very exciting and very important conference with a lot of themes that we will be dealing with. If you cannot attend the sessions, at least I hope you will come back for the lectures. And we will start in just about 7 minutes with the lecture that I will present in later. But first, before we continue with the lecture of Honora O'Neill, I would like to pay some attention to the questions that some of you have put in the Q&A. So perhaps Donya will take a few of these questions, and I'm reading aloud one for Donya for her to answer. Donya, if you can turn on your camera. One question is coming from Anand Shambar, and I think it's a he, but asks, in the model that you presented, social media is at the center, where social media is at the center. Could that be further unpacked in the public and private group communications? Maybe there's a different dissemination and trust mechanism at work in that model. Donya, could you pick up on that question?
Yeah, sure. I think that we, in the case of the pandemic, we really saw multiple different ways in which social media channeled information. And this was evident, for instance, in virologists themselves speaking to various publics, sort of communicating science, but also communicating amongst each other and looking at developments that were happening in various different parts of the world, looking at the science that was being produced in, for instance, among scientists in China who had a bit of a head start, learning from each other at the same time in real time and in a public platform. And so in this way, we have to think not only about some of the maybe takeover roles that social media plays, for instance, of taking over or replacing mass media, and think more in terms of the complexities that social media platforms as new players in the game are actually producing, the new dynamics that they are a part of, and not just thinking in terms of, okay, well, these are specific platform affordances that take over from or replace older affordances of media.
Okay, thanks very much, Donya. There's a second, I think we have time for one short question, and that one is actually very pronounced. It's about the smart exit strategy. It's coming from Anand Schaumbar, and he or she asks, this framing of the the framing may have helped Prime Minister Rutte to secure his re-election, which indeed happened yesterday night, where we were facing the election results this morning. And indeed, that strategy has helped him to continue his re-election and actually succeeded in being re-elected. While in fact, and I'm reading from this question, more COVID-19 infections took place. And it's more or less a comment rather than a question, but I doubt the Dutch media was very critical and fact-checking this narrative, by the Dutch government. Donya, you may not be fully into the re-election results yet, but could you comment on this question?
Yeah, I mean, regardless of, we know in any case that the coalition will be led by the party of Mark Rutte and the VVD. And I think indeed, it really, this whole handling of the crisis shows how important it is to sort of succeed in messaging and framing in a crisis time, and in a moment where there are these sort of stakes around accurately informed policy. And I absolutely think there's a lot of a post-mortem to be done on this election result, in the sense that this was the Dutch policy package a success in terms of tackling COVID-19, or was it primarily a sort of media success in terms of framing and political messaging? I think those are really interesting questions to continue looking into.
Okay, and then just a very brief last question, but I may try to answer that one, but I think, Donya, this is an easy well, not an easy one to answer. Niels Brugge is asking the web feeds sharing their content to social media. So he wonders why we didn't take web feeds into social media into account. Well, the answer is quite simple, because we really had to sort of restrict our research, and the only thing we could actually follow is the social media feeds. So for reasons of brevity, and for reasons of having to restrict the research to just 2 months in specific social media, we didn't include all the web feeds. But of course, you can endlessly enlarge your research area, which we didn't. We only wanted to focus on the social media feeds.